Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Dr. Brian Glibkowski, who is the author of Raise Your AQ, Answer Intelligence. And this is also the topic of today's episode. Dr. Glibkowski, or you'll hear me refer to him as Brian, and I were introduced a few years ago. And I am so honored and fortunate to be one of the co-authors of his sales chapter in his Answer Intelligence book. And you're going to hear me get pretty excited in today's episode because I think Brian's research is fascinating. And the premise of it is that we know so much about questions and the question types, but what about answers? And how about tailoring those answers based off how the person who asked it received it? So Brian has an answer intelligence framework that I have found to be super fascinating as a pre-sales professional. And you'll actually hear my thought process on how this framework can be incorporated into a sales engineering team. So definitely a different episode than what we usually do. But as pre-sales professionals, I think you'll find this episode fascinating. Also, there is an article on the PreSales Collective blog that talks about answer intelligence at a little bit further depth and also has a graphic that we reference a few times through the episode. Enjoy.
Today's episode is sponsored by Consensus. Scale your pre-sales organization and deliver better experiences with intelligent demo automation. Experience an interactive video demo at goconsensus.com.
Brian, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How's it going today?
It's going well. Thanks for having me, James.
It's my honor to have you here. We've known each other for quite some time. Both being in Chicago, we met at a Chicago Innovation Roundtable. Shout out to Patrick Emons for running that event. And you were one of the speakers presenting on answer intelligence. And I thought it was such an interesting topic. I talked to you after the event, and we've obviously stayed in touch. When was that? Do you have any idea when that event was?
It was probably 3 years ago, at least.
Yeah, it was at least 3 years ago, probably closer to 4 years ago. But it's been really wonderful to get to know you, Brian, and see you and your journey on answer intelligence and allowing me to play a small part in that. So you were on TEDx as well, and then you wrote a book. How has that process been for you?
It's been great. And I want to mention from the jump here in terms of the book that you and Devin Reed from Gong were co-authors of a Sales AQ chapter, which is great. The book has, multiple parts, including a third section with different points of focus, sales, interview, teamwork, etc. But the overall process has been great. Wrote a book. Now I'm going to market with some communication assessments and tools and working with certified companies all over the world from Australia, US, London, India, and everywhere in between. So it's been really exciting.
I really appreciate the opportunity. I know Devin does as well. One of my goals had always been to be part of a book, give an excerpt or co-author. So thanks for that opportunity. It was a really cool experience. And funny enough, I had somebody yesterday on LinkedIn reach out to me, say, hey, I saw that you were a co-author on a book. That's something I want to do. How do I go about that? That was always an interesting one. So Brian, let's talk about you before we get into our main subject, because you're not in pre-sales. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and even give us some details into your career?
So my background, I've been in and out of academia as a professor. I'm a management professor trained in organizational behavior and HR. And my research I focused on is questions and then more recently answers. And maybe I could tell you just briefly about this with my background. And I know with questions, obviously from a sales standpoint, sales approaches are often question-based methodologies. So as I was doing this research on questions, I paused and looked around and noticed that we know a lot about questions, going back to grade school, the 6 WH questions, open and close questions, and then sales methodologies based on questions and coaching methodologies based on questions. And I looked even more, books with a question in the title on Amazon outnumber those with the answer in the title 3-1. So I did question research, and then I wanted to focus on answers and sort of identify a typology of answers. We're going to talk about these different answers you can provide to influence others. Did research with the top golf instructors in the world, as rated by Golf Digest and Golf Magazine. So to put a bow on my background, basically, I've done research on questions. I had a software company that focused on how questions can help design surveys. Now I'm focusing on answers and going to market. Been in and out of academia, and that's my story.
Thanks for sharing that, Brian. And I know for me, I love that you have an organizational behavior background because that was one of my favorite classes in my MBA program. And I think those are one of the things that I talked to you about as well. So it's great to hear your perspective because you've been involved in a number of different professions and a number of different industries. And so let's get to today's topic, answer intelligence. And you wrote the book, Raise Your IQ. What is answer intelligence? You started to allude to it a little bit with the golf instructors, but talk to us about what it is.
Yeah, raise your AQ. I'll describe it sort of in relationship to questions. When we think about questions in a sales context and other contexts, they have multiple points of purpose or reasons we use them. The main one is we ask questions about things we don't know. And it sounds very basic. And what is an answer? It fills that gap. So when you fill that gap, you're providing influence to someone else. So answers are an influence tool. If you think about, for example, in a sales context, the proverbial question that keeps the executive up all night, when that executive buyer asks the seller the question and you provide that answer, you've influenced. That's what we're talking about here. And it's a framework of 6 different answer types: story and metaphor, what I call theory, which is business strategy, and concepts, and procedures and actions, which might relate to, for example, features and functions in a technology sales environment. And it's about using this 6 answers related to specific questions. And when you map them properly, when you have knowledge of the answers, you have these effective conversations and you influence people.
I love that you talk about influencing people. And Brian, the example that you're talking about, your graphic, we have actually run an article written by you on the PreSales Collective blog. And this episode is actually embedded in that blog. And so is that graphic. And personally, I'm a fan of it. I really love that graphic because it makes a lot of sense. And you talk about influencing and giving the example of the executive. And I want to get to that. But let's talk about where this concept came from, because I think the genesis of this is super interesting and super relative.
It's sort of one of these interesting samples, I think, particularly for a sales audience, I think traditionally interested in golf.
Yeah, for better or for worse, salespeople and golf will always be associated.
For better or worse, true or not. But as I mentioned, there was all this research on questions. So I wanted to find a sample with colleagues where effective answers were provided. So we interviewed the top golf instructors as rated by Golf Digest and Golf Magazine, did about 25 in-depth interviews, and these were individuals in the upper half of the 99th percentile of their profession. So I'm sure your audience is thinking, why golf? There's 2 reasons. One, they're experts. So whenever you study experts, that's a good thing. You learn how they do it. Second, in terms of them providing answers, it was a great sample because in sort of research speak, there was no restriction of range. So we had these instructors that taught touring pros you see on TV, weekend warriors, your young daughter picking up the sticks for the first time. And what this meant was they were using these answers to influence a wide range of individuals. Those that had deep knowledge of golf like they did, those that had lesser knowledge, those that were highly motivated, those were not very motivated. If you think about that from a sales context, that's perfect. We want to learn from these types of individuals because in a sales context, obviously, you'll have symmetries where people are really interested, less motivated, less knowledgeable. So if we could learn from how these golf instructors did it, then we could generalize to sales and many, many other important conversations.
Super interesting, Brian, especially with the golf pros and the golf conversations. Based off those conversations, is there something that you heard or really listened to during those conversations that has resonated as part of your research?
Great question. There were so many things from the golf instructors. We came up with these, what we call 5 high EQ practices of things they did that made their conversations extraordinary. Maybe I'll just point out 2 of them. One is, and it sounds basic, but being prepared. So one of the golf instructors had a library of 3,500 books, and they were a student of golf, but psychology or anything that remotely touched golf. Now, your listeners, you don't have to read 3,500 books or have a bookshelf like that. But the point is to think systematically about what you're selling and have that depth of knowledge, and in AQ terms, have stories and metaphors and procedures and being really a student of what you're doing. So, for example, in AQ terms, if you tell a story about a client Well, of course, we want to have a great story. But these golf instructors not have one story, but they have 10 stories. They have the right story at the right time. It's that sort of commitment to providing answers. Second, related to that is, we developed this framework of these 6 answers. And in the book, we talk about, in our chapter, selling value. So here's a thought experiment for you. We all think of our value proposition and we're selling value. Can you communicate your value proposition in terms of 6 answers? Story, theory, concept, metaphor, procedure, and action. And to point this out, I've done workshops with a lot of sales organizations, and they may have a lot of good stories, but have you developed a portfolio of metaphors that communicate your value and why you want to work with us? And these golf instructors could use all 6 answers, and they could navigate and fly around any conversation, moving from one answer to another fluidly. And they just had complete command, and they were convincing, they were interesting. And it really was something to behold and listen to them. And you understood why they were so good. And I think the same is true for other great communicators and sales reps and others that I've worked with since.
This is fascinating. This is like where the light bulb moment went off for me, is that when you talked about that these golf instructors, not only did they have stories, they had dozens of stories. And when you mix it with the preparation, and let's talk about pre-sales world, I'm going into a customer conversation. And this time I'm presenting to the CEO and the COO and the EB and the economic buyer. When I go into that conversation, the way that I'm going to pitch my product has to be a little bit different than the way I'm going to pitch my product to maybe the administrator, the person who's going to own this system. And so the impact that these types can make on those calls is palpable. And if you take the steps to put that systematic framework that you mentioned in place, it can be extremely powerful. So let me double down on this personally. One of my concepts as a leader, right, and even with the pre-sales collective, is that I believe that like 60 to 70% of our jobs should be part of a framework. It should be fairly repeatable, that no matter your skill set, you could follow the steps of A, B, C, D, E that allows for systematic approach to things, instituting best practices and scale. That extra 30 to 40% is where the magic happens. That's where our top performers stand out. People put their own creative spin on things. So as a pre-sales leader, what I always wanted to do was take my product and dissect it based off my audience, and then be able to have the repository that you mentioned of stories and metaphors and concepts and procedures, and train my team to answer based off the audience and based off the question that they're asked in the sales process. So maybe it's just me, but this is where like my personal light bulb goes off, Brian.
I love it. And, I like to use AQ when I'm communicating. So it's not just something that it's off on the side. And right there, you're defining a concept about what effectiveness is, 70% focusing on consistency and models and procedures. Now let's transform that. So that's what leadership is to you. That's what performance is to you. Now, as a metaphor, 2 metaphors come to mind for me, and I'm sure you have your own. One is don't reinvent the wheel. And the second I like is innovation occurs at the periphery. So you have a circle where you have your core processes, and there's the innovation that's always on the exterior. And then what's innovative today becomes part of the interior circle tomorrow. So this constant evolution, but it's at the periphery where a lot of that value is created, but you have to have the core sort of formalized in a procedure and approaches. But that's just me responding to you of 2 metaphors. And I'm sure you have other metaphors I'm sure that you'd like to use, but this is part of AQ. This is answering twice here as a concept and a metaphor answer.
Let's maybe talk about answer twice. Can you dig into that concept a little bit further?
Yeah. So those are looking at the blog post. Answering twice, it relates to the 3 primary questions: why, what, and how. So you can think of, for example, why should I work with you? What is your product or service? How do we work with you? And answering twice is to provide an answer that appeals to the logical side of the brain and sort of the creative side of the brain. Just doubling down on what we just talked about, you're talking about, what is leadership or what is effectiveness? You had your concept answer that's appealing to the logical part of the brain, and then metaphors appeal to the more creative side of the brain. And just to give you one more example, why should I work with you can be answered with business strategy. I call it theory in our framework, cause and effect logic. We provide efficiency that leads to higher performance for you, Mr. and Mrs. Client. Then second, you can provide a story that illustrates that theme. And when you provide both, you're really reinforcing that meaning and emphasizing both sides of the brain.
Can you explain in even further depth what the colors mean and how the wheel can actually be used in a sales process?
Another high EQ practice we learned from the golf instructors is answer with style, high EQ practice 4. And there's 3 clusters of answers. So story and metaphor are red. It's relational. You're making an emotional connection. Then you have procedure and action, blue, which are practical, how to get stuff done. Analytical is yellow, concept and theory. And the idea is to connect to that very logical side of the brain. So this is saying, regardless of questions being asked, there's certain style that individuals have, and you want to cater to that style. So to your earlier point, you may have someone you're selling to, let's just say a chief marketing officer that's very relational. They like stories and metaphors. So at a higher base rate, you want to have more stories and metaphors in that conversation, regardless of the questions being asked. And the idea is you can profile different individuals and sort of appeal to their style. And I'll say 2 more things. You also want to be aware of your own style. I'm very analytical, concept and theory. I have to be aware of that and be open to providing more stories and metaphors and procedures and actions. The last point I'll make to sort of put in a different context is in our book on interviews. I interviewed one of my students as part of the chapter, and she talked about getting a job at a Big 4 accounting firm. And what did she do? Every time she was interviewed, she profiled them ahead of time on LinkedIn and said, what kind of style do they have? And if they were relational, again, more stories and metaphors throughout the conversation. And using that high EQ practice and others, when she got the job and the Big 4 accounting firm said she was one of the best communicators they've ever had. The truth was she was excellent as a candidate, but she was using these techniques that anyone can use to really upskill their communication.
I just get so excited when we talk about this, Brian, because it's fascinating. Because I think until you're introduced to this concept, you don't have any idea that this concept actually exists. And the fact that you mentioned relying on our strengths. When I learned about your research, the biggest thing that I focused on was, how do I answer questions? I answer those questions based off how I want to give answers, not how the person receiving wants that answer. And that to me was like, wow, I should probably be changing my approach. And this is what is so fascinating to me, especially as we start talking about profiling people, understanding their role within the organization, understanding the components of their question. What are the actual words in their question that should actually give you a little bit of a clue on how to answer? Do you have any advice for the profiling aspect of things? Because, a lot of times you might not know who this person is or what they're all about, and you have to make a split-second answer to a question happening on the fly.
I would say, first of all, don't overthink it. And if you start to learn AQ and start to practice it, a lot of these identifications of someone's profile happen very quickly, and you sort of pick up on cues. For example, if I tell a little story, and you might want to start little, and you think of this with answers, versioning of answers in terms of length, depth. So I'll start with a little story, a little metaphor. If your eyes twinkle, if you lean in and you get excited, you're starting to give me clues you like that answer, and maybe you want a little bit more. And you do 1 or 2 more of those, and you start to understand maybe what type of answer someone wants. I'm also listening to the types of questions you're asking and the types of answers you're providing. If I'm focused on business strategy, bottom line, and nuts and bolts, and then, I might be telling you that I don't really want to hear a long story. I don't want to hear a long metaphor. I need to know how this connects to my business strategy. I'm busy. And I might be interested in a little bit of how it works, but it's high level. I'm a big picture guy or gal. So it's these little subtle things. I'll mention 2 more things. You can also ask people very innocuously what they're interested in. So you have a question, you say, that's a great question. Do you mind if I provide you a little story to explain that? And then someone's going to say, well, no, I don't want a story, and you're guiding them along. And the last thing I'll mention is sort of like my beginning point is don't worry about it. Once you start going in a conversation, one of the metaphors for AQ is like a spinning wheel, like a bicycle wheel. once you start spinning, the conversation just starts flowing. What you really want to avoid is, just major gaps in your wheel or broken rims. But, once you start going, it's natural, like riding a bike.
Brian, thanks for that background. So one of the things, just to continue to double down on pre-sales on this, is that as you talked about being able to identify who you're speaking to, how you should answer them. One of our partners of the PreSales Collective, Consensus, has put out a concept called the 6 demo types. And they believe that there are at least 6 different types of demos that should happen in a sales process. And so how my thinking has evolved is that you look at the 6 demo types, you look at the audience of who those folks will most likely be, and then how do you build this AQ framework into those 6 types? I've said this time and time again. With my teams in pre-sales, when we are presenting to an executive audience, we need to take a different approach to that. And so having those stories and metaphors and those very impactful, powerful resources at our fingertips should be part of this overall framework. And then for me as a leader, if I'm able to put demo types, audiences, or responses to questions, then I've created a really foundational framework for my team to be very successful in their sales calls. So as that becomes part of the team DNA and part of the team dynamic, it's a lot easier for me to bring people into my organization, train them on this framework, and then allow them to make an impact earlier. And so I have been a big fan of your research. Obviously, that's why I want to have you on the podcast. That's why I was engaged in your book. I think that your research is already impactful, but there's so much potential to bring this into sales conversations and into the pre-sales world specifically, because again, the frameworks and the approach and the thinking differently, thinking about what matters to the person that I'm actually talking to and not myself. Because this is one of the things that tends to happen in our profession is what we call the curse of knowledge. I've given the same demo 1,000 times, Brian. I've given it over and over and over again. When I was at Showpad, I used to be able to give a demo of the product without even looking at the product. I could tell you where every single thing was on the screen without even looking at it. And so over time, that makes me maybe an expert in my product. But at the same time, you talk to folks who finally leave companies after years and years, and they say, why? They said, I'm on cruise control. I'm on autopilot. And you have to take that out when it comes to the selling process. And my last point on this is we do so much on buyer enablement and the sales process changing and buying changing. And so we have to be better as sales engineers, as pre-sales professionals. So how does this framework work within the broader context to make our teams more impactful on the day-to-day? And this is why I obviously get super excited about this and just wanted to highlight that to you.
Now, that's great. Let me respond to some of those points, and just starting with sort of going on cruise control. Let me point out, this is a framework, but this is not a script. It's a framework about how questions and answers are organized, but used effectively, it's a tool similar to like in basketball, you have a layup or a pass, and you have different approaches to go down and score your points, but it's not a script. And sort of commenting a little bit more on this, I've had a good fortune working a lot of different professionals in different areas, and we've worked with improv consultants. And improv is basically a lot of preparation, similar to what we talked about. And then there's rules of improv. For example, yes, and you don't say yes, but you just keep the conversation flowing. But within these simple parameters and rules, it's about navigating dynamically from, in their case, different types of improv. But the same principles apply for AQ, and you have dynamic conversations. And this becomes a framework where you can get out of the rut potentially of just being sort of robotic and having scripts. This is something where you can be alive and in the moment, similar to how improv professionals are alive in the moment. So the point is they have a framework, you can have a framework, and you can be really impactful. I have another point I want to make about personas. The second point is on personas. As it so happens, next month, I was supposed to be doing a live keynote and workshop series for a pharma company on the sales side, not pre-sales, going virtual, but the focus is they've identified a new suite of buyer personas, and they have a similar challenge. They want executive level conversations, just like you were talking about. And one of the key things we're doing is for each of the personas, can you communicate and identify the 6 answers that are most effective and how they subtly differ? How do stories or procedures or different points differ across personas? The same thing for these demo personas. It's about providing the right answers at the right time that really make an impact. And to punctuate this, when we're speaking with anyone, it's about the right answer at the right time. And I can recall interviewing one of the top golf instructors for our research, and this person actually coached many people on the top 50, top 100 list. So this is like the guru's guru. And he was unbelievable at metaphors. And I just asked him, I said, do you always get the metaphors right? And he said, yes. And I believed him. And he says, if I don't, I have a backup one at the ready. And I think that summarizes the attention to detail for each persona, the right answers at the right time. And we've all been there with effective communication, the 2-minute, 3-minute sequence of back and forth where the deal is won. This is the magic we're talking about.
That is so well said. That is fantastic. And actually, to plug in on the PreSales Collective webinar, Peter Cohan and I, early on in the PreSales podcast, did pre-sales analogies and metaphors. So definitely another episode to listen to if you haven't yet. Brian, I really appreciate the conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity to get engaged and involved in AQ. And thank you for that. It's been wonderful to be part of that process and see your successes and feel like, wow, this is great. People are reading my chapter all over the world and getting engaged. How can people learn more? Where should they go?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Brian Glibkowski. Also have a website, raiseyouraq.com. And I would encourage you to look at the assessments page. We have a free Explore AQ assessment. You can take a sales version and test your AQ, your team's AQ. And it comes complete with a 10-plus page PDF report. So I would encourage you to take a look at that.
Fantastic. And again, on the PreSales Collective blog, there is an article on answer intelligence. Brian, thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate the time. Congratulations on your successes and look forward to talking to you next time.
Thank you, James, and congratulations on the success of PreSales Collective. It's been a pleasure to watch your growth and look forward to being a fan going forward. Thank you.
All right, PreSales Collective, answer intelligence. Probably a concept you have never heard of until today. And I hope that you want to learn more because it is really fascinating to think that the details of the question that somebody asks has a particular way to answer. And I love looking at Brian's visual of the different question types and the different answers. As he talked about, if you look at the colors, red means emotional, B means practical, yellow means analytical. And as you heard me get very excited during our conversation, is that I might be in a sales conversation with someone who's going to administrate the platform. They're going to administrate the product. They probably want to know how. And so I should be responding with a procedure and an action. Maybe that person is asking a why, and I should respond with theory and story. And then if they ask for a what, I can respond with concept and metaphor. This framework, maybe paired with demo frameworks, can be very dangerous. On the PreSales Collective LinkedIn, we posted a funny GIF of Larry David responding to a sales rep answering with a great customer story on a call. And while it was supposed to be a bit of a joke, if you think about how this type of framework could actually help your sellers in the process, and if I think about working with salespeople as well, we can give them the tools, give them the resources to be more dangerous in those sales conversations. And just unpacking a little bit more of what Brian said, he talked about 5 high AQ practices, with number 2 being prepared. Preparation is an extremely important part of the pre-sales role. But he talked about number 6 being the different answer types. But number 4 was answering with style, and how all of these concepts come into play when answering a question. For many of us, we probably think, well, yeah, of course, I get objections all the time in the sales process. I know how to answer those questions. Well, do you? Are you answering them the way that you like to answer questions? Or are you answering those questions the way that you like to answer them? Or the way that the person asks them wants the answer? And that is where this framework is so fascinating. And I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, found a little bit different of approach and a different spin to what we do here on the podcast. And again, if you want to learn more, there is an article on the PreSales Collective website. All right, PreSales Collective, as always, like and share our podcast. We really appreciate your support, and I will see you next week.